Welcome to tonight's sleep story. Let's drift into a soothing story together as you begin your journey into a restful and rejuvenating sleep.
The wind howled through the narrow cobblestone streets, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and cold stone. The village was shrouded in a thick layer of frost, the windows of the modest homes blurred by the cold air outside. It was the kind of winter that left no room for warmth, where every breath seemed to freeze in the air before it could leave your mouth. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, covering everything in a soft, white blanket. The streets were eerily silent, save for the occasional crunch of footsteps on snow, and yet, despite the oppressive cold, the village felt alive. There was an energy here, simple, grounded, and steady. People moved quickly, bundled in their woolen cloaks, going about their daily tasks with quiet determination. Farmers worked the land, their figures hunched under the weight of the harsh winter, while women tended to the fires in their homes, their faces glowing with the warmth of the hearth. The village, though small, was full of life, and it was here, amidst the simple routines of winter, that the two men whose fates had been woven by greed, wisdom, and the power of choice were about to cross paths. The first was Big Klaus, a man of wealth and ambition, but also of cruelty. His house stood at the far end of the village, its stone walls grander than any other. He had a large estate, well-tended fields, and plenty of servants. He spent his days in his warm, luxurious home, enjoying the comforts of life, yet he was never satisfied. His heart was cold, just as the winter winds outside, and the wealth he had amassed was never enough. His insatiable hunger for more land, more riches, more power had defined him for as long as anyone could remember. Big Klaus sat in his great hall that evening, near the roaring fire that warmed the room. He sipped from a glass of wine, his fingers lightly tapping against the rim of the cup. His eyes were narrowed as he stared into the flames, the flickering light casting shadows across his sharp features. His mind was always racing, always searching for new ways to grow his wealth, to increase his power, to make the world bow before him. But there was something, missing something he could not quite grasp. Across the village, in stark contrast, stood Little Klaus, a man who had none of the wealth and comfort that Big Klaus enjoyed. His home was small, just a simple cottage at the edge of the village, the roof sagging from years of neglect. Inside, the flickering fire struggled to keep the cold at bay, and the walls were lined with the meager possessions of a poor farmer. He had no riches to boast of, no servants to command. His life was a constant struggle to make ends meet. But there was something about Little Klaus that set him apart. Klaus was wise, far more intelligent than anyone gave him credit for. He had learned early in life that survival was not about brute strength, or wealth. It was about wit. His mind was his most valuable asset, and though he lacked the material wealth of his neighbor, he held something far more valuable: the ability to think, to plan, and to outwit his adversaries. He was the quiet observer, always watching, always learning, and though he was poor, there was a calmness in him that Big Klaus could never possess. While Big Klaus sought to control the world around him with money and power, Little Klaus found solace in simplicity. He spent his days working the fields, tending to his animals, and making do with what little he had. There was no grand ambition, no desire to conquer the world. For Little Klaus, life was about finding peace within himself. no matter how difficult the world outside might be. But despite their differences, these two men shared something in common. Both sought to change their fates. Big Klaus, consumed by his greed, would stop at nothing to gain more. Little Klaus, with his quiet wisdom, would seek to outwit the forces of power and corruption that threatened to swallow him whole. And so, as winter raged on and the village lay under a blanket of snow, their fates began to intertwine. Little did they know, their paths would soon cross in a way neither could have predicted. The morning after the soldier now, Little Klaus, had crossed paths with Big Klaus. The cold air still hung thick in the village. Snow continued to blanket the rooftops, but there was a subtle change in the atmosphere. It was as if the world itself had sensed a shift, a turning of fate that neither man could yet understand. Little Klaus walked through the village, his mind still churning over the strange encounter from the night before. He had always known that Big Klaus was a man driven by greed, a man who would stop at nothing to increase his wealth, but he hadn't expected to be drawn into his machinations so quickly. Big Klaus had no idea how deeply Little Klaus's mind worked and ignored. But Little Klaus was different. He knew how to read people, how to listen to the unspoken words between them. He understood that Big Klaus's arrogance could be his greatest weakness, a weakness that Little Klaus could exploit. The problem was, he had to find a way to make Big Klaus notice him not as a poor farmer, but as someone capable of changing the very course of his life. That afternoon, Big Klaus returned to his grand home, his mind still restless with plans of expansion. His land was already vast, but it wasn't enough. His fortune, as it grew, only seemed to create new desires, new ambitions. There was always something else he wanted. He had heard rumors of a lucrative trade route that could make him wealthier than any noble in the land. But there was a problem. In order to secure his place, he would need to purchase the rights to land from the local lords. And in order to do that, he would need a large sum of money, something far beyond the reach of his current means. It was here, in this moment of frustration, that the idea struck him, an idea that would lead him to Little Klaus. A crafty grin spread across his face as he thought about the poor farmer who had come to him earlier, asking for help. Little Klaus was a simpleton, right? At least, that's how Big Klaus saw it. A man too meek to challenge him, too unremarkable to be a threat. But he had an idea. What if Little Klaus could be used, manipulated, to gather the resources Big Klaus needed? A poor man would do anything to escape his poverty, and Big Klaus had the power to offer him what he needed, in exchange for a small favor, a small, exploitative favor. Big Klaus arranged to meet Little Klaus again, knowing that the poor farmer, desperate for money, would be too willing to accept his offer. He invited him into his large, lavish home under the pretense of helping him, playing the part of the generous benefactor. When Little Klaus entered the grand home, he couldn't help but feel a little out of place. The coldness of the stone walls, the towering furniture, the opulence of it, everything about this world screamed wealth and power. It was a world far removed from the simple life he had known. But this was the moment he had been waiting for. He had learned long ago that survival was not just about physical strength. It was about understanding the world and understanding people. And now he would use that knowledge to turn the tables. Big Klaus welcomed him with a warm, exaggerated smile, guiding him into a plush chair by the fire. The room was filled with the scent of roasted meats and the crackle of the fire in the hearth, a stark contrast to the cold that still lingered outside. "Ah, Little Klaus, how good of you to come," Big Klaus said, his voice warm and inviting, but with a glint of something more calculating in his eyes. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night. It seems you're in a bit of a bind." "Yes," Little Klaus nodded, playing along with the act. "Indeed, I am," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. "But I am willing to work hard, sir. I can do anything. Just give me a chance." Big Klaus chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, I believe you. You're a hard-working man. But you see, I have a proposition for you. A way for you to change your fortune if you're willing to listen." Little Klaus raised an eyebrow, sensing the trap before it was even laid. "What do you ask of me, sir?" I need a partner, Big Klaus continued. "Someone who can help me secure a very important deal. A deal that will make both of us incredibly wealthy. You see, there's a piece of land that I need, but I cannot acquire it alone. It requires a man of, let's say, less conscience. I've heard you're quite clever, Little Klaus, more clever than most. What do you say?" The offer hung in the air between them like a sweet temptation, and Little Klaus knew exactly what Big Klaus was asking. He wanted to use him, take himself. But Little Klaus wasn't fooled. He knew exactly what kind of man Big Klaus was: greedy, manipulative, and willing to sacrifice anyone to achieve his goals. Little Klaus paused, considering his options. He could refuse, but that would mean living in poverty for the rest of his life. It would mean continuing to scrape by, struggling in a world that had no mercy for men like him. Play along with Big Klaus's game, and use it as an opportunity to outwit the man who thought he could control him. "I'll do it," Little Klaus said, his voice steady. "But I want something in return. I'm not doing this for nothing." Big Klaus raised an eyebrow, surprised at the sudden demand. "What do you want?" "I want a fair share of whatever we gain from this deal," Little Klaus said, leaning forward slightly. "No tricks, no schemes, just a fair share. If I'm going to help you, I'll need to know that I'm not just being used." Big Klaus hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, but then he smiled, a sly grin. "Agreed. You'll get what you're owed, Little Klaus. A fair share. Just don't make me regret this." This was his moment to play his cards, to outwit the man who thought he could use him. And in that moment, he knew that he would not only survive, but thrive. Big Klaus had underestimated him, and that would be his downfall. The days that followed. The agreement between Little Klaus and Big Klaus were quiet, but filled with an undercurrent of tension. Little Klaus worked diligently, playing the part of the loyal servant, attending to Big Klaus's every need with careful precision. He knew that his role in this game was not just to follow orders, but to carefully study the man he was dealing with. Each movement, each word, each decision, Little Klaus observed, listened, and waited for the right moment to strike Big Klaus' eyes. The older man, ever consumed with his ambition, busied himself with securing the resources for his grand deal, while Little Klaus kept close, offering his assistance whenever needed. Ordinary partnership of a rich man and his humble servant. But Little Klaus knew better. This partnership would never be what it appeared. It was, on the 5th day, when the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the village, that Little Klaus saw his opportunity, the lucrative land deal he was about to finalize. The old man spoke of it like a conquest, and Little Klaus could feel the arrogance dripping from every word. The deal was a long time in the making, but Big Klaus had no idea that his partner, the seemingly humble man by his side, had already learned enough about the deal's weaknesses to exploit them as the evening wore on, and the men enjoyed their wine by the hearth. Little Klaus saw an opening. Big Klaus was drunk, though not enough to lose his composure, but his usual careful control over his words had loosened. The man's greed had made him careless. Little Klaus seized the moment, listening intently as Big Klaus rambled about his plans for the land. "The lords don't know it yet," Big Klaus said, leaning forward with a smug grin. "But I'm going to turn this land into something they'll never expect. I'll build a fortune on it, a fortune so big none of them will be able to touch it. That's where you come in, Little Klaus. Help me secure the final papers, and you'll get your share. You'll be a rich man, too, a partner, even." Little Klaus nodded, as if he were eager to play his part, but inside, his mind was already turning. He knew that the key to Big Klaus's downfall lay in one simple mistake. The lords, the very people Big Klaus had been courting, had no idea of the land's true value. They saw it as nothing more than a patch of arable land, but in reality, it held a hidden treasure mineral deposit that Big Klaus had kept secret. He was going to deceive them into paying an inflated price for land that was barely worth a fraction of its true value. But Little Klaus had other plans. He wasn't interested in wealth alone. He was interested in justice. Make sure that the deal backfired on Big Klaus in a way the greedy man would never expect. The next morning, Little Klaus left the house earlier than usual. He walked through the village, the crisp morning air filling his lungs, his mind sharp with purpose. He had a plan, but it required more than just a simple trick. It required finesse, timing, and the trust of the people who could see through Big Klaus's lies. Little Klaus knew just where to go. He made his way to the local inn, where the lords, who were negotiating the deal with Big Klaus, often stayed. The innkeeper, a stout man with a friendly face, greeted him warmly. Little Klaus was a familiar face in the village now, a man who had quietly earned the respect of those around him. He didn't speak loudly, but when he did, people listened. "I need to speak with the lords," Little Klaus said softly, his tone respectful. "It's important." The innkeeper hesitated, but nodded. "They're breakfast, but be quick, my friend. They're not the patient sort." Little Klaus thanked him and made his way to the back of the inn, where the lords sat around a large wooden table, his hands clasped behind his back. "Good morning, lords. I've heard of the deal being made with Big Klaus, and I felt I should offer you a word of caution." The lords exchanged puzzled glances. The youngest of them, a man with sharp features and an impatient air, spoke first. "And what would a poor farmer like you know about business deals?" Little Klaus smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed to catch them off guard. "I have heard talk of the land's value. I know what Big Klaus is hiding from you." At that, the room fell silent. The lords were intrigued, their skepticism giving way to curiosity. Little Klaus walked closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, ensuring only they could hear. "Big Klaus intends to sell you the land at an inflated price, he said. He hides from you the true treasure, beneath it the valuable minerals that could make it worth far more. Do you want to be a part of his deception, or would you rather see it exposed? Asterisk. The lords leaned in, their eyes narrowing. Little Klaus had their attention now. I can help you, he continued. I can expose the truth about the land, show you its worth, and ensure that Big Klaus does not make a fool of you. Must act quickly. The youngest lord stood and stepped toward Little Klaus. You speak of things we did not know. What is it that you want in return? Little Klaus met his gaze with unwavering confidence. I want what is fair. I want to ensure that Big Klaus does not get away with his greed. Help me, and I will ensure you get the land for its true value. No tricks, no lies, only fairness, the youngest lord said. We will follow your lead, but we must act fast. Little Klaus smiled, knowing that the game was now set. He had played his cards perfectly. Not only had he outsmarted Big Klaus, but he had also turned the tables in his favor. Now, it was only a matter of time before Big Klaus would see the consequences of his greed. The sun hung low in the sky as Little Klaus left the inn, a sense of quiet triumph settling in his chest. Heavy, but it felt right, like a step toward something greater, something beyond survival. He had outwitted Big Klaus, exposed his deception, and gained the trust of the lords. Now, he was on the verge of achieving what he had once only dreamed of, a life built not on power or wealth, but on fairness and respect. The cold winter air nipped at his cheeks as he walked back to the small cottage he called home. With each step, he thought of how his life had changed. Not long ago, he had been just another poor farmer, a nameless face in the village. But now, through his cleverness and his unwillingness to be manipulated, he had found a way to break free. From the cycle of poverty and dependence, he reached his humble cottage and paused for a moment, looking up at the smoke curling from the chimney. It was a small home, but it was his, and in that moment, he realized how far he had come. Without fear of exploitation was a new kind of wealth. As he stepped inside, the warmth of the fire greeted him. He removed his heavy cloak, shaking the snow from it, and sat by the hearth, lost in thought. The greedy man would surely attempt to retaliate, control. But Little Klaus was ready. His mind was sharp, and his resolve was unwavering. The following day, Little Klaus met with the lords once again. The lords, now fully aware of the true value of the land, had made their move. The soldier now, a man of strategies, stood at the center of it all, guiding the process with calm authority. Today is the day, Little Klaus said to the lords, his voice steady. Today we take what is ours. The lords, once skeptical and dismissive of Little Klaus, now looked to him for guidance. He had proven himself time and again, showing not just wisdom, but courage. They respected him, and they were ready to follow his lead as they made their way to Big Klaus's grand estate. The tension in the air was palpable. Little Klaus walked at the head of the group, his heart steady, his mind clear. He had no fear. This was his moment, the culmination of everything he had worked for. The power was shifting, and he could feel it. When they reached Big Klaus's home, Big Klaus, who had been lounging in his opulent study, looked up in surprise as the group entered. He was dressed in his usual fine clothes, a glass of wine in his hand, his smug smile barely faltering as he saw little Klaus leading the charge. But there was something different in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, of fear. He had underestimated this poor farmer, and now, it's more than just a visit, Big Klaus. This is the end of your greed, the end of your manipulation. The lords behind him stood tall, their faces set with determination. They had come not just for the land, but for justice. Big Klaus had deceived them, had tried to profit from their ignorance. But that was about to end. I've come to settle the deal, Little Klaus continued, and I will make sure that everyone knows what you've been hiding. You thought you could control the land and the people, but you were wrong. Big Klaus's face twisted with anger, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Could no longer be ignored. I've been patient with you, Big Klaus, Little Klaus said, his voice calm but firm. But now it's time to face the consequences. The land you've tried to sell is worth nothing compared to the lives you've ruined. Today, you'll see what happens when a man finally stands up to greed. Big Klaus opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. The realization was sinking in. The land, the wealth, it no longer mattered. You want the land? Take it. But no, there is no satisfaction in this. Little Klaus stepped closer, his eyes sharp. We've learned that lesson already. We've learned that true wealth isn't in land or gold, it's in the choices we make, the people we trust. And today, we make the right choice. As the lords took the land documents from Big Klaus, the tension in the room lifted. The greedy man had been brought to justice, and the truth had won. Little Klaus's eyes softened as he looked at the lords, his work done. The land was no longer just a piece of property, was a symbol of his victory. A victory over greed, over injustice, and over the life that had once bound him. The village was quieter now. The oppressive tension that had once gripped the streets, slowly beginning to lift. Little Klaus. The very people who had once dismissed him as a poor, insignificant farmer now looked to him with newfound respect. Little Klaus, though humble by nature, the journey to this moment had been long, filled with difficult decisions and moral dilemmas. Little Klaus had chosen to use his wit and wisdom to outsmart Big Klaus, but there was a lingering question in his heart. Had he truly done the right thing? As the days passed, Little Klaus found himself reflecting on the events that had led to his success. Was he still the same man he had been before? All this began. Could he remain true to himself after using his intellect and cunning to outmaneuver the greedy man? In the evenings, when the village grew quiet and the fire in his hearth flickered softly, Little Klaus would sit by the window, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. He thought of the simple life he had once known, of the days spent working the land, of the peace that had come from a life of honesty and hard work. But now he had become a figure of power in the village, and with that power came expectations. People sought his advice, his guidance, and some even looked to him with the same kind of awe that had once been reserved for Big Klaus. It was a strange feeling, a mixture of pride and discomfort. Little Klaus didn't want to be seen as a leader, not in the way Big Klaus had been. He didn't crave wealth or power, but he had learned that sometimes, to protect what you love, you must stand firm, even when it feels unnatural. He had used his cunning to win. As Little Klaus sat at his modest table, a knock echoed through his door. He opened it to find the village elder standing. There, a man whose wisdom had always been sought after by the villagers. His eyes, though old, still held the sharpness of one who had lived through countless seasons. "Little Klaus," the elder said, his voice soft but steady, "I've been thinking about what you've done. It's no small thing to defeat a man like Big Klaus, but there's more to life than victory. You've won, but now you must decide what to do with the power you have." Little Klaus hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. He had known this conversation would come. The elder had always been perceptive, and he was right. There was something unsettling about the power he had gained. "I didn't want power," Little Klaus said quietly. "I just wanted to live in peace. I never sought to control anyone. But now it feels like I've become part of a system I never wanted to be a part of." The elder nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not always a curse, but it can make you forget what matters. What you need to ask yourself, Little Klaus, is whether this victory, this power you've gained, is truly worth the cost of your soul." The words hung in the air, heavy and contemplative. Little Klaus stood there, uncertain. Had he allowed his quest for justice to turn into something else, something darker, something that would change him forever? The elder placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him in the present. "You've done good work here, but remember, what you do now is what will define you in the future. Power is a tool. It can build or destroy. The choice is yours." Little Klaus nodded, the weight of the elder's words sinking in deep. He had known in his heart that this was the true test. The victory over Big Klaus was just the beginning of a much greater journey. The journey to understand how to wield the influence he now had. Could he lead with compassion? Could he help others without succumbing to the temptations that had led Big Klaus down his dark path? Later that evening, as the village settled into the stillness of the night, he closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the fire envelop him. Gently as he made his decision, he would not be like Big Klaus. He would not allow himself to become consumed by the same greed and hunger for control. His journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt that he was on the right path, a path of wisdom, integrity, and humility. And with that, Little Klaus knew that he had found the strength to face whatever came next, with the hope that one day the village he had saved would be a place where peace reigned not because of power, but because of love and understanding. Days turned into weeks, and Little Klaus continued to embrace the responsibilities that came with his new position. The once quiet, humble life he had known now seemed like a distant memory. He had become an unexpected figure of influence in the village, a man whose wisdom was sought after not just for his cleverness, but for his ability to bring about change. People came to him for advice, for counsel, even for solace. They no longer saw him as just a poor farmer. They saw him as a leader, someone who had the power to change the course of their lives. But with that power came a new weight, a heaviness that he had not anticipated. It was one thing to outsmart Big Klaus, to win his battle against greed and manipulation. It was another thing entirely to use that victory for something greater, something lasting. Little Klaus began to feel the weight of the choices he had made, the responsibility to ensure that the power he held was used for good. He could no longer afford to be reactive, responding only to immediate threats and challenges. Now he had to think long-term, to plan for a future that was not just about survival, but about creating a better world for the people around him each day. As he walked through the village, he saw the faces of the people he had sworn to protect. There was the baker, whose pastries had brought comfort to the weary, the blacksmith, who had repaired tools and weapons for the farmers, and the young mothers, who cared for their children and ensured that the next generation grew up strong and kind. These were the people who made the village what it was, the heart of it, the soul of it. They were simple people, living simple lives, but their world was now in his hands. One evening, as the sun set and the cool evening breeze began to settle in, Little Klaus found himself sitting alone by the village well. The peaceful sound of water trickling over the stones filled the silence, and for a moment he let his mind wander, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He had never sought power, never wanted to be a man of influence, but now that he had it, he could not deny the pull of his new role. It was a responsibility that was both humbling and terrifying. He could hear the laughter of children playing in the distance, the soft murmur of conversations coming from the nearby homes, the rustling of leaves in the trees. The village was alive, vibrant, and full of potential. Yet, in the quiet of the evening, he felt the isolation of his choices. He was no longer just a poor farmer. He was a man who held the future of this village in his hands. The fear of failure gripped his heart, but he knew that he could not afford to be paralyzed by it. He had to move forward, step by step, even if the path ahead was unclear. It was then that the village elder, the same wise man who had guided him before, appeared beside him. The elder's presence was always calming, like a steady hand on a turbulent sea. "Little Klaus," the elder said softly, sitting down beside him, "I can see the weight upon your shoulders. You've done well, but the road you're walking is not an easy one." Little Klaus nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground before him. "I never thought it would be like this. I thought if I could defeat Big Klaus, everything would be simple. But now I'm not so sure." The elder smiled gently, his eyes crinkling at the corners with the wisdom of years lived. "It's easy to fight against a single enemy, but when you step into the role of leadership, you fight for everyone. The decisions you make will affect their lives, and that is not a responsibility to be taken lightly." "I didn't want this," Little Klaus admitted, his voice quiet. "I didn't want power. I just wanted to live honestly, to be free of the lies. But now, it feels like the price of that freedom is too high." The elder nodded, understanding the struggle in Little Klaus's heart. "Freedom is not free, my friend. It comes at the cost of hard choices, of standing firm in your beliefs, even when the world pushes back. But remember, you are not alone in this. The people you've fought for, they are your strength, and they will help you carry the burden." Little Klaus glanced up, meeting the elder's eyes. "But what if I fail them? What if I make the wrong choice?" "Then you will learn, as we all do," the elder replied gently. "Failure is not the end, it is a teacher. What matters is how you rise from it. What matters is that you continue to choose what is right, even when it is hard." Little Klaus took a deep breath, the weight on his shoulders feeling a little lighter now. The elder's words had given him clarity, the reminder that he was not alone in this. It was true that leadership was a burden, but it was also an opportunity, chance to shape the world around him, to create something lasting and meaningful. The elder stood up slowly, his old joints creaking as he did. Remember, little Klaus, it is not the size of the victory that defines us. It is the integrity with which we fight. Keep your heart true, and the rest will follow. With that, the elder walked away, leaving little Klaus sitting alone by the... Well, the night now fully settled around him. He sat there for a long time, the village's quiet sounds wrapping around him like a blanket. The weight of the choices ahead still pressed on him, but it no longer felt like an insurmountable burden. He was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that he had the strength to make it through. The people of the village were counting on him, but more than that, he was counting on himself. And with that, a quiet resolve began to settle in his heart. The road ahead was long, but he would walk it with integrity, with the wisdom he had learned, and with the hope that he could make a difference. The days that followed Little Klaus's conversation with the village elder were filled with a quiet intensity. The weight of leadership still hung heavy on his shoulders, but now there was a purpose behind it. He knew that his decisions could shape the future of the village, and with each passing day, his resolve strengthened. One morning, as he was walking through the village square, Little Klaus was approached by a group of villagers. They were the farmers, the craftsmen, and the traders who made up the heart of the community. They came to him with hesitant smiles, their faces full of concern. Little Klaus, one of the farmers began, we've heard whispers of a new challenge. Big Klaus may have been dealt with, but there are still many in the neighboring towns who see your rise as a threat. They won't forget how you exposed Big Klaus, and they may try to undermine you. Little Klaus looked at the faces around him, each one filled with a mix of fear and hope. The reality of his position was becoming clearer every day. It wasn't just about defeating one man, it was about securing a future for all of them, a future where they could live in peace without the threat of exploitation. I understand, Little Klaus said, his voice steady, but we can't live in fear of what might come. We must move forward together as a community. I will not let this village fall to fear. The group nodded, reassured by his words, but there was still a lingering unease. They had seen the consequences of Big Klaus's greed and were hesitant to trust anyone with power again. Little Klaus knew that earning their trust would take time, but he also knew that it was the only way forward. He would have to prove that he was different from Big Klaus, that his leadership was not born from greed, but from a desire to protect the people he had come to care for. The following week, news arrived that a neighboring lord, a powerful and influential figure from a nearby town, was planning to visit. The villagers whispered in hushed voices, unsure of what this would mean for their future. Would this lord support Little Klaus, or would he seek to undermine him as Big Klaus had tried to do? Little Klaus gathered the villagers together in the square that evening, determined to face the challenge head-on. As the villagers gathered, Little Klaus could see the uncertainty in their eyes, the fear that they might once again be caught in the web of manipulation and control. We don't know what this visit will bring, Little Klaus began, his voice calm but firm. But I know this week cannot let fear guide us. We must stand together as a community and show them that we are not afraid. We will not let the past dictate our future. There was a murmur of agreement among the villagers, and for the first time, Little Klaus felt the strength of their support. They were beginning to believe in him, in the idea that they could build something different, something lasting. But there was still much work to be done. This visit could either solidify his position or send everything crashing down. The day of the visit arrived, and the village was buzzing with anticipation. Little Klaus stood at the front of the square, waiting for the Lord's arrival. He had no idea what this Lord would be like, but he knew that he had to be prepared for anything. The villagers looked to him for guidance, and in that moment, he realized that his leadership was no longer just about making the right decisions. It was about being the beacon of hope that they needed. As the Lord's procession arrived, Little Klaus stepped forward, greeting him with the respect befitting his station. The Lord, a tall man with sharp features and a cold demeanor, stepped down from his horse and regarded Little Klaus with a calculating look. He was clearly a man of power, used to having people bow before him. "You must be the man who has taken control of the village," the Lord said, his voice deep and authoritative. "I've heard much about you. You've caused quite a stir in these parts, haven't you?" Little Klaus stood tall, his eyes meeting the Lord's without flinching. "I've only done what was necessary to protect the people of this village. We have no need for greed or power here, only peace." The Lord's gaze hardened for a moment, as if testing Little Klaus's resolve. But then, to his surprise, the Lord nodded slowly. "Peace, you say? That's a rare commodity in these lands. But I will admit, your efforts have been impressive. Perhaps we can work together after all." Little Klaus was taken aback. He had expected a much more hostile reception. But the Lord's words were measured, and there was something in his tone that suggested a mutual respect. Little Klaus had passed the first test, but he knew that the real challenge lay ahead. The Lord's visit wasn't just about words, it was about actions. Would this man honor his promises, or would he seek to take advantage of the village as Big Klaus had done? Over the course of the following days, Little Klaus worked closely with the Lord, demonstrating his willingness to cooperate and showing that his intentions were sincere. He arranged meetings between the villagers and the Lord, ensuring that their voices were heard, that their needs were met. Little Klaus did not demand wealth or power. He simply sought to protect the village and its people. By the end of the week, the Lord had offered his support, agreeing to work with Little Klaus to secure the land and protect the village from outside threats. The villagers were cautious, but they could see that Little Klaus had won a victory. He had turned a potential conflict into an opportunity for growth, securing the village's future, and, most importantly, proving that leadership born of integrity and compassion could succeed where greed had failed. As the Lord departed, Little Klaus stood at the edge of the village, watching the dust rise behind the Lord's carriage. He felt a sense of relief, but there was no time to rest. The village had taken a crucial step forward, but the road ahead would not be easy. There would be more challenges, more choices to make. But for the first time, Little Klaus felt confident. The path he had chosen was the right one, and with the support of the village, he would face whatever came next. The days following the Lord's visit passed with a quiet yet palpable shift in the air. The villagers had begun to accept that change was upon them, though some remained cautious. Little Klaus had proved himself, at least for now, as a capable leader, but he knew that his newfound position came with its own set of challenges. The quiet calm he had initially felt was slowly replaced by a growing sense of responsibility. His life had changed in ways he hadn't fully anticipated, and the weight of his decisions seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. One evening, as Little Klaus walked through the village, he noticed the faces of the villagers. The same faces he had seen for years, their eyes now full of respect, but also expectation. There was a subtle tension in the air, as if the people were waiting for something more from him. They had trusted him with their future, but how long would that trust last? Would he be able to live up to the expectations placed on him? Would he remain the man who had once worked the fields with them, or would he be swallowed by the very power he had resisted for so long? As he approached the small village square, he saw the familiar sight of the blacksmith's shop. The blacksmith, a burly man named Joran, was one of the village's most respected figures. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke louder than any speech could. Joran had helped Little Klaus countless times in the past, mending tools and offering advice. But tonight, as Little Klaus approached, Joran was standing outside the shop, his hands on his hips, watching him with a keen eye. Little Klaus, Joran greeted him, his tone serious. I've been thinking about everything that's been happening, the Lord's support, the land deal, all of it. I respect what you've done for the village, but you need to understand something. Little Klaus stopped in his tracks, sensing the gravity in Joran's voice. What do you mean? Joran looked around, ensuring no one else was nearby before he spoke again. Power, Little Klaus, is a tricky thing. It changes a man. I've seen it happen before. You've gained their trust, yes, but don't let it fool you. There are others in the region who won't just stand by and watch you take control. You've made enemies, and sometimes when you're in charge, it's easy to forget who's really on your side. The words hit Little Klaus like a cold wave. He had always known that power came with its risks, but hearing it spoken so plainly by someone he respected made it all the more real. He had gained the support of the villagers, yes, but what if they turned against him? What if his decisions started to alienate them, just as Big Klaus's greed had alienated his own followers? I know the cost of leadership, Little Klaus said quietly, his gaze falling to the ground. But I also know what it means to live in a world ruled by greed and deception. I can't go back to that. I won't. Joran nodded, his expression softening. I know you, Little Klaus. I know you're not like Big Klaus, but you're still a man. And every man, no matter how wise or well-intentioned, faces the temptation to take more than he should. Don't forget who you are. Don't let the power blind you. Little Klaus stood in silence, absorbing Joran's words. The weight of them pressed down on him more deeply than he had expected. He had never desired power, but now that he had it, he had to remember what truly mattered. He had to protect the people, not control them. He had to remain the man who worked the fields, the man who had fought for fairness, and not let the lure of power pull him away from the values that had always defined him. Thank you, Little Klaus finally said, looking up at Joran with a sense of resolve. I won't forget. As Little Klaus turned to leave. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something larger than himself. The challenges ahead were uncertain, but he had learned that leadership was not about seeking approval or power. It was about staying true to one's values, no matter the cost. And as he walked back through the village, he felt a renewed sense of clarity. He had made a choice, and now he would see it through. The days turned into weeks, and Little Klaus's life continued to shift, like a river carving its own path through the landscape. The village, once small and quiet, now pulsed with a new energy. His leadership was no longer just a promise, it was becoming a reality. Yet, as he looked around at the faces of the villagers, there was an unsettling realization that grew inside him. The harder he worked to guide them toward peace, the heavier the burden on his shoulders became. Little Klaus spent his days overseeing the construction of new homes, organizing the farming efforts, and mediating between the different factions of the village. The lords were pleased with the progress, and their promises of further support seemed genuine. But each decision he made, each step he took, carried with it the weight of responsibility. The more the village prospered, the more he began to understand the complexities of leadership, the hard choices, the compromises, and the constant scrutiny of every action. One evening, as the sun began to set and the air grew cool, Little Klaus found himself at the edge of the village, overlooking the valley where the crops grew. He leaned on a wooden fence, looking out over the fields that stretched out before him. The soft rustling of the wind in the trees and the distant chirp of crickets were the only sounds in the otherwise still evening. The peacefulness of the moment contrasted sharply with the tumult inside him. The decision he had made to keep moving forward despite the risks was not without its consequences. He could feel the villagers' expectations pressing against him. The support they had once offered freely had transformed into a quiet demand. They expected him to continue delivering, to lead them not only through prosperity but through peace. But was that even possible? Could he truly bring about a world where greed and power no longer held sway? Little Klaus, a voice broke through his thoughts. It was Joran, the blacksmith, who had become one of his closest allies. Joran walked toward him, his broad shoulders casting a shadow in the dying light. He had always been a man of few words, but Little Klaus valued his counsel. "What's troubling you?" Joran asked, his eyes sharp with concern. Little Klaus straightened, turning to face him. "I've been thinking about what comes next. The village is thriving, and the people are trusting me, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched by more than just the villagers. The lords may have agreed to support us, but how much of that support comes without strings attached?" Joran nodded, understanding immediately. "You think the lords have ulterior motives?" "I don't know," Little Klaus admitted, rubbing his temple. "But I can't ignore the possibility. I've seen how easily greed can take hold, how quickly people can forget their promises when more is at stake. What if this peace we've created is nothing more than a delicate illusion? What if, just beneath the surface, there's something waiting to shatter it?" The blacksmith considered his words carefully before speaking. "Power has a way of making people forget who they really are. And when it comes to power, there's always someone who will try to take it for themselves. But you've made this village stronger. You've shown them that there's more to life than just surviving, that there's something worth fighting for. But at what cost?" Little Klaus asked, his voice quiet. "I'm starting to wonder if I'm losing myself in the process. I wanted to protect them, to build something good, but it feels like every choice I make has consequences I didn't expect. How do I know I'm doing the right thing?" Joran gave him a thoughtful look, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "The right thing isn't always clear, Little Klaus, but you've got something not many others. Have a heart that cares for the people around you. Don't let fear guide you. If you keep doing what you've been doing, putting them first, thinking of what's best for the village, you'll find the right path. Trust yourself." Little Klaus exhaled slowly. The the weight in his chest easing slightly. Joran's words were simple, but they carried a weight that went beyond the immediate concerns of the moment. For the first time in days, he felt a spark of clarity. "I'll do my best," Little Klaus said, his voice firming with resolve. "I can't promise I'll always know what's right, but I'll do what I can. I'll protect the village." Joran smiled, giving him a nod of approval. That's all anyone can ask for. As the evening grew darker, Little Klaus and Joran stood in companionable silence, watching the stars begin to appear in the vast sky above. The weight of the world still rested on his shoulders, but for the first time in a long while, Little Klaus felt a sense of peace. The village was more than just land or power, it was the people, their lives intertwined with his own. And that, he realized, was the foundation upon which he would build his future. The days grew longer, and the village, once quiet and unassuming, continued to hum with life. Little Klaus had settled into his role, the leader they never expected, and yet now could not imagine their lives without. But the peace he had worked so hard to establish felt, at times, as fragile as glass, beautiful, but precarious. As the seasons shifted, so did the nature of his leadership. The lords, who had supported him with promises of land and protection, began to look at him differently. At first, they had been content with their agreement, impressed by how Little Klaus had transformed the village. But now there were whispers in the corridors of power, and those whispers made their way to Little Klaus's ears. There was talk of expansion of land that could bring more wealth, more resources, more power, and the lords were increasingly eager to claim it. The more they demanded, the more Little Klaus began to question their intentions. One evening, as the last light of day faded into twilight, Little Klaus stood by the village well, watching the shadows stretch across the earth. The air was cooler now, and the first signs of autumn were in the trees' leaves beginning to turn. The crisp scent of the approaching season in the air. He had spent most of the day meeting with the village elders, discussing the lord's new proposals. They wanted more land, more crops, more control. The more they demanded, the more the village seemed to stretch, like an expanding balloon, fragile and about to burst. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. It was Joran again, the blacksmith, whose presence had been a constant reassurance in the days that followed the village's rise. Joran approached slowly, his expression serious. "I've heard some troubling news," he said, his voice low. Little Klaus turned to face him, his brow furrowing in concern. "What is it?" "The lords," Joran began, his tone steady, but with a hint of something deeper, something that betrayed his concern. "They've been making promises about more land, more power, but I'm hearing that there's a plan one that doesn't sit right with me." Little Klaus felt a tightness in his chest, the familiar unease creeping up his spine. "What do you mean?" "They're talking about taking more from the villagers," Joran continued, his face hardening. "The lords want to increase their hold on the land. They want to push the farmers harder, extract more crops, work the fields with more labor. It's the same old story, control through greed." Little Klaus's mind raced, the weight of Joran's words sinking in. He had known this moment might come, the inevitable conflict of values, but he hadn't expected it to happen so soon. The power he had worked to build, the trust he had cultivated among the villagers, now seemed at risk. The lords, the very men who had helped him secure this peace, were beginning to show their true colors. Little Klaus sighed, a deep exhale that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "I can't let this happen," he said firmly. "The people have trusted me. If I let this go, if I let the Lords push them to the edge, then everything I've worked for will fall apart." Joran nodded. "We can't let them turn this into another game of greed. We have to do something." But Little Klaus knew that the path forward wouldn't be easy. The Lords were powerful men, their influence stretching far beyond the village. A confrontation, a direct rebellion, could lead to chaos, to a rift that would tear the community apart. Yet doing nothing wasn't an option either. The balance of peace he had fought for could not survive under the weight of unchecked greed. "I'll meet with them," Little Klaus decided, his voice steady, though there was a storm brewing in his chest. "I'll speak with them, try to reason with them. If I have to, I'll stand my ground." Joran raised an eyebrow, the weight of his concern clear. "You're going to stand alone against the Lords?" "Little Klaus, they don't care for reason. This is about power, and they'll stop at nothing to get more of it." "I know," Little Klaus replied, his voice quiet but resolute. "But the village needs to see that I'm fighting for them, not for power, not for land, but for what's right." Joran looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll stand with you, then. The village will stand with you. If they see you fight for what's right, they'll follow." The next day, Little Klaus rode out to the nearby town to meet with the Lords. His heart was heavy, his thoughts swirling. He had faced challenges before, but this felt different. The stakes were higher, the tension greater. He could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing on him. He was no longer just a farmer. He was the leader of the village, and the future of the people depended on him. But as he rode through the streets of the town, passing the busy markets and the wealthy homes, Little Klaus steeled himself. This wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about land. It was about the people, the life he had built with them, and the choices that would define his legacy. When he arrived at the Lord's estate, the gates were open and the Lords were waiting. In their grand hall, dressed in fine clothes and surrounded by opulence, Little Klaus entered the hall with his head held high, his steps measured and deliberate. The Lords greeted him with polite smiles, but he could see the hunger in their eyes. They saw him as an obstacle, someone who had risen too quickly, someone who could disrupt their plans. Little Klaus, one of the Lords, said, his voice smooth and condescending, "It's good to see you. We've been discussing the future, and we have some new ideas about how we can expand the village's prosperity. More land, more crops, more wealth for all." Little Klaus's gaze hardened, and he stepped forward. "This isn't about wealth," he said, his voice cutting through the air. "This is about the people. You want to take more from them, push them harder, work them to the bone, but I won't let you." The Lords exchanged glances, their smug expressions faltering. They hadn't expected resistance, not from someone they had helped elevate to power. "I won't be a puppet," Little Klaus continued, his eyes sharp. "I've fought for the village, for its future, but I will not sacrifice the well-being of these people for the sake of your greed." The Lords' faces darkened, but Little Klaus stood his ground. He could feel the weight of his words, the truth of them, and for the first time, he felt that he was truly leading, not with power or deceit, but with integrity. The tension in the air was thick as Little Klaus stood in the Lord's grand hall. the Lord's cold eyes boring into him like daggers. The weight of his words hung between them, and for a long moment there was nothing but silence. Little Klaus had spoken with conviction, but the Lords were not the kind to be easily swayed. They had grown accustomed to getting what they wanted, and now, faced with resistance from someone they thought they controlled, their arrogance began to show. One of the Lords, the eldest and most powerful, stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "You dare defy us, Little Klaus." His voice was low, menacing. "You've become a leader in this village. Yes, but your position is fragile. You have no army, no true power. You cannot simply stand against us. You will lose." Little Klaus stood tall, though his heart pounded in his chest. He had known this moment would come, but the reality of it still sent a chill through him. The Lords before him were powerful men, and yet he had something they did not. He had the trust of the people, something that money and land could never buy. His mind raced, searching for the right words, the right response to keep the village safe, to protect what they had built together. "I do not seek power," Little Klaus said, his voice steady, "but I will not let greed destroy the lives of the people who have trusted me. I may not have an army, but I have something far more valuable: the support of the villagers, the strength of the community. We will not be bullied." The Lord sneered, his expression hardening. "Your community is nothing but a handful of poor farmers and traders. You have no idea what you're up against. You've played your part, but now you're out of your depth." Little Klaus could feel the weight of their words, but his resolve only strengthened. He had faced countless challenges before: poverty, hardship, even the death of those he loved. But none of that had broken him. He had learned the value of perseverance, of standing firm in the face of adversity. Now, standing before these powerful men, he knew what he had to do. "I will not allow you to destroy the village I've worked so hard to protect," Little Klaus said, his voice unwavering. "If you think you can take what belongs to the people, you are wrong. I will fight you not with power, but with the strength of every person who believes in what we've built together." The Lord's eyes narrowed, and for a moment it seemed as if the two were locked in a silent battle of wills. The Lords had expected Little Klaus to back down, to cower before their power. But instead, he stood his ground, unwavering, and for the first time, the Lords began to realize that this simple farmer, this man they had underestimated, was not so easily intimidated. The eldest Lord spoke again, his voice colder now, as if weighing his options. "You are a fool, Little Klaus. You think your village will stand against the might of the nobility. You will be crushed." But Little Klaus remained firm, his gaze never leaving the Lords. "We'll see who is the fool. The people are not your pawns. They will not be controlled. I will fight for them, and if that means standing against you, then so be it." The Lord took a step back, clearly weighing the situation. His eyes flickered with something that resembled doubt for the first time. "Very well," he said, his tone now laced with cold finality. "We will not strike today. But this is not over, Little Klaus. Remember that." As the Lords left the hall, their once imposing figures now retreating in silence, Little Klaus stood there, heart pounding in his chest. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The Lord's words hung in the air like a threat, a shadow that would follow him. There was no turning back now. The next morning, Little Klaus returned to the village with a sense of cautious optimism. The villagers greeted him as he entered the square, their faces filled with quiet hope. Word of the confrontation had already spread, and the people were looking to him for guidance. But he could see the unease in their eyes. They, too, knew that the challenge was far from over. He gathered them in the square, the familiar warmth of their presence surrounding him. "The lords have backed off for now," he said, his voice steady, though his heart was still heavy. "But this is not the end. We must be vigilant. They will not forget their desire for more power. We must stand united, as we always have. Together we are stronger than anything they can throw at us." The villagers nodded, their faces full of resolve. They trusted Little Klaus, and now, more than ever, they were ready to stand by him. The battle was not yet won, but Little Klaus knew that, with their support, they could face whatever came next. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Little Klaus stood at the edge of the village, looking out over the fields. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves of the trees and sending a chill through the air. The village was quiet, but beneath that quiet there was a sense of determination, of unity. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time Little Klaus felt ready. He had faced the lords, had stood up for what was right, and now he would continue to fight for the village, for the people, and for the future they would build together. The days following the confrontation with the lords were quieter than usual, but the tension that had once filled the village was still palpable. The villagers continued their daily routines, tending to crops, mending tools, and caring for their homes. But now there was a different energy in the air. A sense of unease had settled over the village, but it was mixed with a quiet resolve. The uncertainty of what lay ahead loomed over them all, but the people now looked to Little Klaus with trust in their eyes. Little Klaus had spent the days after the confrontation carefully considering his next steps. The lords had backed off for now, but their hunger for power had not disappeared. He knew that they would not be easily deterred, and that the village was still at risk. It was not just about the land, but about control, about who would hold the power in the region. He had successfully stood up to them, but he knew that they would be watching, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. As he walked through the village, Little Klaus noticed the subtle changes in the way the villagers looked at him. It wasn't fear or reverence. They weren't looking to him as some sort of savior, but as a leader who had proven his worth. The weight of that realization settled upon him once again. It was no longer just about surviving. It was about leading, about protecting, and about making choices that would shape the future. That evening, as the sun set and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Little Klaus stood at the village square, looking out over the people who had come to trust him. The air was cooler now, the last remnants of summer slipping away as autumn approached. The village, bathed in the warm light of the setting sun, felt peaceful. But Little Klaus knew that peace could be fleeting, and that it was something worth fighting for. It was then that the village elder approached him, his wise eyes full of knowing. "You've done well," the elder said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years lived. "But there is much yet to be done." Little Klaus turned to face him, his expression thoughtful. "I know," he replied. "The lords are not done with us. They will be back, and when they do, we must be ready." The elder nodded, his gaze steady. "You have the support of the village, Little Klaus. But it is not just power that you must wield. It is wisdom, compassion, and the trust of those you lead. They follow you not because you are strong, but because they believe in you. Remember that the strength of a leader is not in the force of their will, but in the hearts of the people who stand with them. Little Klaus absorbed the elder's words, the weight of them sinking in. He had fought for the village, for the people, and that fight had given him something more valuable than wealth or power: the respect and loyalty of the people he had vowed to protect. As the elder walked away, Little Klaus stood alone in the square, his mind quiet for the first time in days. The village was more than just land or property. It was the people, and in the end, it was their trust, their belief in him, that would carry him through whatever challenges lay ahead. The sun had dipped completely below the horizon, leaving behind a soft twilight glow. The village, though still small, felt stronger now, and as Little Klaus looked out over the fields, he knew that he was ready for whatever came next. The path would not be easy, and there would be more battles to fight, more decisions to make. But as long as the village stood by him, he would continue to lead them with the wisdom and integrity they deserved. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, Little Klaus felt that he could face it with confidence. He had found his place, not through power, but through trust, and that was a foundation stronger than anything else. And so, as the night settled over the village, the sounds of crickets filled the air, and Little Klaus walked home, his heart steady and his mind clear. The story of his journey was far from over, but he knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them with courage and the strength of his people behind him.